Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Winter and Spring Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask a question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 to 30 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but not expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we do have a YouTube channel. Please see the icon at the top of our website to access it. And this talk is actually being recorded for that channel and will be posted shortly thereafter. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker and someone I'm thrilled to have. Justin LaBorde, PhD, is a strategic consultant and frequent speaker on consumer trends, marketplace insights, and business growth strategies at Fortune 500 companies. Raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, Justin now lives with his wife Amanda and their three children in Cary, North Carolina. Today, Justin's going to discuss his latest book, Scattered Far and Wide, The Naval Academy Class of '38 at War, which tells the war stories of U.S. Navy shipmen from the class of 1938. The reviews have all been top shelf. I'm just going to read two of them. Captain Stan Fisher, no stranger to this audience, he actually spoke for us about a year or two ago, writes a nostalgic and intriguing read about a cadre of United States Naval Academy graduates during the interwar period, young men who commissioned into a world that would soon be on fire. From their days on the grounds of Annapolis to the skies and seas of the Second World War, Justin provides an intimate look at the lives of the United States Naval Academy class of 1938 as midshipmen and officers, their triumphs and tragedies, and a perspective into some of the most critical events of the naval war that you will not find anywhere else. While Vice Admiral Ted Carter Jr. Concludes, capturing the extraordinary bravery and sacrifice of the class of '38, scattered far and wide, is a tribute to the resilience of those who served in the Pacific War. Their stories of determination and leadership under extreme conditions exemplify the fighting spirit of our naval forces. A must read for anyone seeking to understand the true essence of heroism at sea. And with that, I will turn it over to Justin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Greg. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to talk to all of you about the Naval Academy and some of the stories that I uncovered during the course of my research and writing this book. And I got to say, I uncovered some what I think are just some amazing stories that were relatively unknown and few that were told before. So that was the goal of the work, was to get some of the stories out there of some people that I have just become just so enamored with, and some young men who I think did some truly heroic things. I got asked a lot in the course of writing this book, why are you writing a book about the class of 1938? Why not 1937, 1936, 1939? And it's a good question. And there were a couple different reasons, not the least of which is my grandfather graduated in the class of 1938. So that was a pretty compelling reason. And he had a lot of material from the Naval Academy at that time. He had a lot of unpublished memoirs from some of his classmates. But I remember as a kid looking through all of his material and really getting interested in not just the Naval Academy, but his time at the Naval Academy. Because as Greg said, these people that he graduated with, he and his classmates graduated at a time where they sort of had some ideas of what was coming, but there was no real certainty. They knew Hitler was causing some problems and Mussolini was causing some problems, and there were some rumblings of things going on in the Pacific, but they certainly had no idea of what was to come. And what did come, obviously, was this transformative event in world history, and certainly a transformative and momentous event in their lives. And they were entering into their careers in the Navy as young men, as barely out of college, but they had some experience that I think other classes didn't, certainly later classes didn't. There was a great book written recently by Craig Simons about the war, the class of 1940. And it's just as good. I mean, it's just the stories there are wonderful. But what I think sets this book apart a little bit is that there was a little bit more distance between when these midshipmen graduated and when the war started. So they were already out there flying planes. They were already out there as officers on ships. They were already out there as officers on submarines. And when the war kicked off, I think they had a bit of a unique perspective. So they weren't yet at the captain or admiral level, certainly, but they weren't just at the ensign level. They were out there in command of some men already doing some really interesting things. So that's why I ultimately picked 1938. And frankly, what started the book was I remember looking at my grandfather's edition of the Lucky Bag, and the Lucky Bag is the yearbook that the Naval Academy publishes each year, and it's just a beautiful volume. And he had his yearbook fairly prominently displayed, and I remember looking through his pictures and thinking to myself, what happened to these men? What happened to the guys in these photos? And so that was the reason for doing this. And it's just been, frankly, just a wonderful experience to go down the road of really looking into some of the stories. And so that's what I'm going to do today is share some of these stories with you, share some of the things that I learned about some of these men. And it's just been, like I said, a really fun experience. So I'm hopeful that you find it that way as well. Just wanted to start with just a quick overview of the Naval Academy. Again, it's just one of those places that has a long history of instilling honor and patriotism and competence and responsibility and courage in its graduates. And I think that all started, frankly, going back to when it was founded in the early pre-Civil War era. But one of the things, if you go there, you'll see this banner. And this is a flag that I think really instills what the Naval Academy is all about. This original banner, "Don't give up the ship," that Commodore Perry flew from his flagship during the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. It captures the words of James Lawrence, who uttered those words a month or two before on his flagship when it was going down. Don't give up the ship. He was grievously wounded. And it is still there. It's just a beautiful relic that's still on camp on the yard. You can go and see it. It used to be blue. Now it's this sort of brown color. But I love this picture. I always talk about this picture because I think it encapsulates exactly what the Naval Academy is trying to do. And I think it really does reflect so well on the graduates. And I think the stories that I'm going to tell you, I think are just emblematic of this banner and this credo that the Naval Academy instills. Very quickly, I think this is a good place to start, is to give you a bit of an overview of the class of 38 and who they are. A really interesting group, reflective of that time. You can see here, not a diverse group, all white. It was not fully unsegregated. I'm sorry, not fully segregated during that time. There were some Hispanic midshipmen, including Edmundo Gandia, who graduated in 1938. He was from Puerto Rico. They had had an Asian American graduate in 1934 was the first, but the first African American didn't graduate until 1949. The first females didn't graduate until 1980. So it was a group of, at this time, largely white men, but they were diverse in a lot of ways. They were certainly diverse in terms of their economic background, certainly diverse in where they came from all 50 states, came from some territories, came from Puerto Rico, as I mentioned. Not all of them were straight from high school. You had some midshipmen who arrived as fourth years who had served in the fleet, and that was one way to get into the Naval Academy, to go actually into the fleet and then come into the academy after a couple years. They were all unmarried. You could not be married or have poor eyesight or have other physical attributes that they deemed unworthy of selection. You had to pass sort of not just mental tests, but you also had to pass some physical tests. In 1934, 612 were sworn in, and 438 would graduate 4 years later. That was about average. You had a lot of people every year in the Naval Academy at this time not meeting muster, not passing for various reasons. And so they would get sent home, and that was kind of always the way it worked. You always typically had around that number graduate. 438 graduated, 26 joined the Marine Corps. Ultimately, 42 would die in combat in World War II. So that's about 10%. Now, that's roughly average for those classes that graduated in the late 30s and the early 40s. Certainly, there were some that had a higher percentage, but 10% was about average. 78 served 30 plus years in the Navy, captains, admirals, for sure. Now, I always kind of like to show this picture up there because these are some of the stories that I'm going to tell. These gentlemen on this slide. My grandfather, incidentally, is actually that gentleman all the way to the right, Alden LaBorde. He graduated with the group, graduated 16th actually, which we're very proud of. Became a destroyer commander and captain. Spent most of his time in the war ferrying convoys across the North Atlantic. So certainly has some wild stories about that. Once the war in Europe ended, he went over to Japan and was on a minesweeper for a while off the coast of Japan. And then the war ended and he went home and got out of the Navy shortly after that. But incidentally, he's one of those folks who, right after he graduated, was not allowed to continue in the Navy because he had such bad eyesight. And so in 1938, he was sent back to Louisiana. But then when the war started, boy, did they need officers. And so he was recalled back into the Navy, was very excited, and had a wonderful career where, despite his eyesight, I guess, as he always told us, the eyesight didn't hold him back. But what I want to do today is talk about some of, again, the stories that I include in the book of some of these men and stories from across a couple of different branches of the Navy. And that's what I think is so important and so interesting about this group is you had the group that went off and stayed in the fleet and stayed on surface vessels, and you had a group that went off and became naval aviators. And boy, did they do some things as naval aviators. And then you had some that went off and signed up for submarine duty, which was still in its infancy, but it all, a lot of different guys went into the subservice. And it was interesting. It seemed to be unique in the sense that if you were on the lacrosse team at the Naval Academy at that time, you went into the submarine service for whatever reason. A lot of those lacrosse players went in and became submariners, but they did a variety of different things. So writing the book from that standpoint was a lot of fun because I got to focus on a lot of different things, a lot of different battles. I'll tell you the main thing that I really enjoyed about writing the book though was the chance connections that I was able to uncover. You have about 400 classmates all scattered throughout the different fleets and all the different aspects of the naval service during World War II. But they came together in very interesting places. They came together and they saw each other and they got to hang out and they even served together around the world during World War II. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. And I just loved uncovering these moments where members of the class of 1938 came together. One of them was in February of 42, right after the war kicked off, obviously, in the North Atlantic. And one of my favorite um, folks to write about is a gentleman named Ray Calhoun. And I'll get to his story a little later on because I'll go into something that he did during the war. But Ray Calhoun is on a destroyer and he's in the convoy of a carrier that's in the North Atlantic at that time. And he's serving on a destroyer. And he's watching carrier operations one day take place across the sea on the Wasp. And he can see planes coming in and planes taking off. He's in the screen, so he's pretty close to the Wasp at that time. And he sees a plane come in and crash. And that was a frequent occurrence during these relative infancy of carrier operations in naval history. But he sees a plane crash and go into the water. And he and his destroyer that he's on are sent to try to find the downed airmen. Usually what happened is the planes would stay on the surface of the water for a little while, hopefully a couple minutes, allow the pilot to get out and to get into the water. But they get over to where the crash site occurred near the carrier, and they don't see any of the airplane. And it's just disappeared. And they never find the airplane. They never find the pilot either. And it's presumed that he went down with the plane. And so he gets back to shore, back to the east coast of the United States, and he finds out that the plane that he watched crash had a classmate of his on it. Frank Case was his name, and he was just an amazing man, amazing young officer. He was very, very well regarded at the academy. I mean, he actually was a very, very good friend of Ray Calhoun's. Very sad story, but again, I think it's just one of those instances of where these connections, these chance encounters, these sort of serendipitous moments came together. And I loved finding these moments. There was another one where in the night before Midway, Norman Cleese, who's a very famous member of the class of 38, is hanging out in the hangar of the Enterprise. And his best friend, Tom Eversole, comes up to him. And they're looking at one of the planes, one of the Devastator torpedo bombers in the hangar of the Enterprise the night before Midway. And they have a conversation. And Tom Eversole is a devastator pilot. He's a torpedo pilot. And Norman tells him, "What are you doing? Why are you all flying this plane? You shouldn't be flying the plane. I thought the officers and the admirals knew that this torpedo plane was obsolete and it wasn't an effective plane." And again, this is the night before one of the most important battles in human history. And Tom Eversole, all he can do is shrug and say, "Yeah, we know that it's a bad plane, but we're going to have to go in and fly it anyway tomorrow." And that sense of, I know it's a bad situation that I'm going to be piloting this plane that is obsolete and doesn't stand a chance against Japanese fighters, but I'm going to do it anyway. That bravery, that sense of don't give up the ship. And this conversation that these two classmates and friends had the night before the battle was just really, really, really moving. And then in another instance, and these are just three, I'm going to talk about a little later on how four members of the class, Bruce Garrett, James Marks, Ray Calhoun, and another classmate, came together in one of the world's big storms off the coast of the Philippines in 1944 and talked to each other during that time and worked together to try to get through this storm. But it was those, again, those chance connections that were just so interesting. So let me go ahead and get started. I want to keep an eye on the time and make sure I leave some time for questions. I'm going to tell you a couple different stories again about these extraordinary young men, and I want to start with a guy named Eric Allen. He was nicknamed Ethan Allen. He was from Vermont, so that would make sense. He was a graduate, again, of 1938, wanted to be a minister, and was a member of the drama club at the academy. Had a wonderful voice, apparently, and a wonderful sense of humor, and was just a real good swimmer. And after the academy, wanted to fly. He wanted to be a naval aviator. And what you had to do at that time was go serve in the fleet for 2 years and then apply to flight school. And it was very, very hard to get into. But a lot of members of the class of 38 applied and got in. And once you got in, you still had to excel at every one of the different levels of flight school. And Eric Allen did. And so Pearl Harbor comes around. And Eric Allen is a member of a fighter squadron on board the Enterprise. And he's a member of VF-6. And the Enterprise was not in Pearl Harbor that day, thank goodness. But it wasn't far away. It was the one carrier that was nearby. As I'm sure all of you know, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor looking for, expecting to find potentially, but hoping to find at the very least all of the different carriers that the Pacific Fleet had. And they had three. They were all gone. The other ones were all gone, but the Enterprise was close by, not in the harbor, but well south of Pearl Harbor that day. And so Pearl Harbor happens. The Enterprise hears about it. And what the Enterprise does is stays to the south of Pearl Harbor that day looking for the Japanese fleet. And of course, the Japanese fleet was not south of the islands. After the raids on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet was away, well away, sailing back home to the north. But they got a report on the Enterprise, and Halsey's on the Enterprise at the time, and they get a report that says the Japanese fleet has been spotted southeast of the islands. And so they put together a strike package and they send it off to look for what they have heard is the sighting of the Japanese fleet. And Eric Allen is part of the fighter escort. So he's escorting the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers. And of course, they fly out. It's getting late in the day, almost evening time, and they don't find anything but open water. And they fly around for a bit, use up a lot of their fuel, and then they have to head back to the Enterprise. But it's getting dark now, and Halsey doesn't want to turn on his carrier lights. He doesn't want to land these planes. He knows they're low on fuel, but he tells specifically his fighters, his 6 fighters of Eric Allen, Eric Allen's one of them, to go land at Pearl Harbor. Don't land on the carrier. And they have just enough fuel to make it. They're a little worried about that, but they say, okay, this is their orders, so they're going to go do that. They're worried about landing at Pearl Harbor because they know it's going to be dark and they know it's going to be dangerous. And they know what's happened that day. They know Pearl Harbor has been attacked by planes from the air. So they're a little hesitant. And in all honesty, if you read about this, what happened here, there are a lot of people that are hesitant about sending these planes to land at Pearl Harbor, not the least of which is Halsey. And Halsey radios ahead. He breaks radio silence and tells Pearl Harbor, "I've got fighters coming in to land." These are U.S. fighters. These are friendly fighters. In fact, there were members of this fighter squadron at Pearl Harbor that day. One of them had flown in earlier in the day when the attack was still going on. And he makes sure he tells everybody These are American planes. Let them come in and land. But it's nighttime by the time that these six fighters get over Pearl Harbor, and it's dark. And the only lights that they see over the harbor are the fires from the bombs that are still burning. Everything else is down. But these guys are smart, and Eric Allen's he's sixth. He's in the back end of this formation, and they turn on their lights and they do everything that they can think of to make sure that they alert everybody in the harbor that they're American fighters. And they come in. And it's interesting if you read about all the steps that had been done. It is not for trying that the tower, that the naval personnel in the harbor that day tried to alert everyone they could that these were American fighters. But you can guess what I'm leading up to as they coming in for a landing, I believe at Ford Field, if I'm not mistaken. And it is believed that machine gunners on the aft end of the USS Pennsylvania were the first to open up. And they opened up their anti-aircraft guns on these six planes as they're coming in for a landing. And it's an episode of friendly fire. And once the members of the anti-aircraft crews on the Pennsylvania started, the descriptions of what happened next are really startling. Apparently, anti-aircraft fire from everywhere on the harbor opened up next, and all directed at these six planes. Even men and Army guys with guns, rifles, scattered throughout the harbor were aiming for these planes and shooting them down. And it's very sad. I mean, if you think about it, a Grumman does not look like a Japanese plane. Apparently, it doesn't sound like a Japanese plane. But as I say in the book, it flew and it droned, and honestly, that was enough for these angry men, these hurt men, these humiliated men in Pearl Harbor to fire back at what, as far as they knew, was another Japanese raid. So the planes are coming in for a landing. Again, Eric Allen is in plane number 6. The first 3 planes all get shot down. One of them does a controlled landing and the pilot survives, but the first 2 pilots are shot down and killed. One of them is pulled from this crashed plane and dies that night. The second guy in line, he's killed right away, becomes the first naval aviator killed during the Pacific War. Eric Allen is at the back end. The other 2 planes ahead of him managed to escape, so 3 have been shot down. 2 managed to escape, and then he's at the back end, and he's shot down as well. Now he has just enough time to parachute into the water, and he makes it. Though he lands hard, he makes it into the harbor there, and he starts swimming. And he's swimming through just an ocean of oil. It's just really, really thick. Thank goodness he's a good swimmer. He gets pulled out of the water. He gets found. He gets pulled out of the water. He gets taken to a hospital. And while the doctors are scrubbing off all of the oil that's on him, they notice that Eric's been shot. And he's shot in the torso. It hits him. I believe it punctures his lung. And they do what they can. They do their best. But unfortunately, Eric Allen passes away that night from friendly fire. A very sad story, but it's interesting. Obviously, I think as we all have, I've read a lot about Pearl Harbor, read a lot about World War II. It's one of those stories that I knew nothing about. Had never heard of that before, and to think about just who do you blame in situations like this? If you can blame anybody, do you blame Halsey for sending these planes back to land at the harbor? Do you blame the gunners on the ships? Do you blame the tower? Do you blame the naval personnel at Pearl Harbor for not doing enough? I don't think you can blame anybody, honestly. It's just one of those fatal mistakes, as friendly fire always is, that unfortunately resulted in the death of just a fine young man, actually fine young men who died on the first day of the war. So very, very, very sad story. But anyway, we're going to get to some happier stories, but just another interesting story of what happened with the class of 1938 during World War II on the very first day. The next story is one that is a mystery and another story that I had not heard of, but it's a fairly well-known story. And I included in a chapter called Stand By, as I'll show you here in a minute, but it's about Ernie Cody. Ernie Cody, member of the class of 38. He's one of those guys who went out into the fleet first, right out of high school, served a couple years in the fleet, and then applied and got into the Naval Academy. So he was a bit older than the other first classmen who graduated with him. His nickname was Dewey. Very, very handsome man, as you can see here, almost looks like a Hollywood matinee star at the time. It was interesting the way that his biography of as while he was a student at the academy describes him. His views have not coincided with those of the academic departments, which is I think, a funny way of saying he may have struggled academically a bit, but he graduates and he was very highly regarded, true friend, earnest and sincere, very good young naval officer. He went into the naval aviation at the military once he graduated in the Navy, but not a fighter pilot or not a torpedo bomber, not a dive bomber. He was a blimp pilot. The Navy had a blimp service at the time. And usually what they did was fly off the coast of the U.S. looking for submarines or doing some reconnaissance and some scouting. They carried a depth charge that they could drop on submarines if they saw any. But their big primary service during the war was going up and down the coastlines looking for subs or ships or any sort of invasion force. So it was very important work. Um, Ernie Cody actually had some distinction as a blimp pilot. He flew vitally needed parts out to Doolittle's carrier before they took off for the Doolittle raid, and dropped some really, really important parts that his bombers needed to get off the decks of the plane and of the aircraft carrier and carry out the raid. So he had some distinction for doing that, for getting the blimp out to the carrier, hovering it on the flight deck, and so dropping the tools on the deck that the bombers needed. But he's flying out of San Francisco a couple years into his service, and he's uh, a fairly highly experienced blimp pilot at the time, and he's flying a blimp called the L-8. And the L-8 takes off from San Francisco. Its mission is to go a couple miles out off the coast to some rock islands that are out there, and then head north on sort of a triangular track, looking for submarines, and then come back to San Francisco. And he's on there with one other guy, a guy who's incidentally enough was born and raised in Lakehurst, New Jersey. I found that just extremely interesting. There was supposed to be a third guy who joined them, a third pilot in that crew cabin underneath the blimp, but the blimp was overweight because of dew on it that morning. They took off around 6 in the morning, so they had to reduce some weight. So they had to get rid of the third pilot. So there's only two. There's Ernie Cody and his co-pilot, and Ernie Cody's at the controls that day. After about an hour into the flight, they radio back. Ernie Cody radios back that they want to investigate something in the water. And he says, stand by. And then they never hear from Ernie Cody or his co-pilot again. Those are the last words. There's a nearby fishing vessel that sees the L-8 come down to the water, almost water level, and then hover there for a minute, and then it shoots back up into the air. And while it's up in the air, eventually what it does is it runs out of fuel and it starts to drift. At this point, uh, there's a lot of confusion as to what's going on. Eventually, what starts to happen is people who are on the beach in California see the L-8 fly over the coastline, and it looks like this in this slide that I've got up here. You can see it doesn't look right. There's something wrong with it. You can see that it looks low on helium. It looks low on gas. There's that dip in the middle, and that's kind of the telltale sign that it's low on gas, helium, because the weight of the crew compartment pulls down the center. So something's off, obviously, and a lot of people notice it, and they also notice that it's making no noise. The engines are off at this point, and they wonder, what are the pilots doing? Flies over the coastline of San Francisco into Daly City, California, where it crashes in the middle of a residential street. And one of the very first people on scene is a firefighter, and he's got an axe, and he goes to break open the door and see if the pilots are hurt, but the door is already open, as you can see in this picture here. And when they look in to the crew compartment there, they don't see anybody. Nobody's in the crew compartment. Something happened to Ernie Cody and the co-pilot. After they said stand by, at some point, probably right after that, something happened. And to this day, they don't know what. The story of Ernie Cody and his co-pilot is still a mystery. Now, there have been lots of theories. Certainly, I think the Naval's point of view, if you look at the report, is that when they went down to the surface of the sea to investigate something, they don't know why the blimp went down so low. But when they did, somebody must have fallen out. And then maybe the co-pilot, one of them reached over and tried to grab that person and also fell out. Problem with that is they never found any of the bodies, and Ernie Cody and his co-pilot never turned up again. So there was some confusion. There was still a hat on top of the console that certainly somebody would have put on if they were leaving it on purpose. There was some thought that maybe one of them was some sort of Japanese agent, and they left to get on a Japanese submarine that was in the area, although that never really seemed to really make a whole lot of sense. Nobody radioed anything in terms of distress or mayday. Nothing was ever seen by any of the fishing vessels that were in the area. Of course, people thought it might be aliens that had something to do with this, but that's one of the things that was mentioned as potentially a reason why. There was a witness who saw the blimp flying over the coastline and said she saw three people in the crew cabin when it went over. Again, who was that third person? That's kind of the question. It's a very interesting story. Again, it was never solved. The Navy eventually, after saying Ernie Cody and his co-pilot were missing, declared them dead. It was a big shock to his wife and his wife's mother, his mother-in-law. Um, his wife's mother-in-law, interestingly enough, said she saw Ernie Cody on a street one day, years later, in Phoenix, Arizona. And he had a look on his face that he was suffering some sort of mental episode. And she swears by it. And she says she knew Ernie Cody and she would have known if it was Ernie Cody or not and recognized that person as Ernie Cody. Um, Probably the sadness talking, you would think. But again, it's Navy's point of view that they never officially could determine what happened to Ernie Cody and his co-pilot on the L8. The L8, incidentally enough, is still available to see. It's at a museum today. I find it interesting though that they used the L8. It was claimed to be haunted after this episode, but they used it as the crew compartment to a Goodyear blimp that apparently was flying over football games for decades. So it had a life after this incident. But again, another story that I just found fascinating that I knew nothing about, the mystery of the L8. It's a well-known mystery. A lot of people know about it, but it involved a member of the class of 1938. Two more stories for you as I take a quick look at the time, and I want to leave some time. A story that isn't about a member dying or going missing, but is about a member of the class enduring. And I want to talk about Carl Dwyer because I think his story is just one of those that I just found fascinating. He's from Oklahoma, and he is highly esteemed at the academy, very smart. He goes into the engineering and mathematics route, very careful with his finances, loved to tease other people, was an athlete too. And Carl Dwyer goes into the submarine service. And he becomes the gunnery officer on the Puffer. And in 1943, September of 1943, the Puffer is sent out on its first war patrol. So he's a relatively new submariner, but he's a gunnery officer by virtue of his rank. And by all accounts, he was a good one. The Puffer was a submarine with a 63-man crew, and they go off into the Makassar Straits, which is north of Australia. It's in and around Indonesia, which at the time was the Dutch East Indies, and very warm water in the Indonesia at that time. Bathwater, warm water, I read. So apparently when the exterior water is really hot, obviously that makes the submarine very hot, particularly when it's on the surface. So it was not a comfortable cruise. And unfortunately, it would get a lot worse because the Puffer's out on this war patrol and they see a convoy. And the Puffer's CO does what everybody should do in a submarine and what they were ordered to do in a submarine, which is to attack that convoy. And so they do, and they get very quickly depth charged in return. The convoy had some escorts, and these Japanese escorts went after the Puffer after it fired some torpedoes and sank a ship or two. And the Puffer gets depth charged, and they're not sure why, but something happens to the Puffer. Even though it's submerged, it can somehow be tracked on the surface. Their thinking is that the depth charges maybe damaged the sub in some way where it was releasing some bubbles or something, maybe some oil or something up onto the surface that allowed the Japanese to track where the sub was going. And so the Japanese did. The Japanese destroyers and corvettes that were out there providing escort service tracked the submarine and continually dropped depth charges. And every turn the puffer made, the Japanese were able to track and were able to follow. So the puffer with Carl Dwyer on board couldn't surface and had to stay submerged and had to go deep. And it's getting depth charged. It's accumulating damage. There's some light flooding that's going on that's making the sub sink a little further than it should. It eventually goes down to, I believe, a depth of maybe, I think, oh gosh, maybe 500 feet, well below its test depth. And World War II submarines were not designed to stay submerged for long. They sailed. When they sailed, they were on the surface, and they were fast on the surface, and they were relatively comfortable on the surface. And then if they had to get submerged, things became very quickly uncomfortable, and they were slow, and things got very hot. The air got very stale. And there's a section in the book where I describe what happens to them because Carl Dwyer and the puffer have to stay submerged for over 30 hours, 38 hours total. They stay submerged, something submarines were never designed to do. It becomes the longest continuous submerging of any submarine during World War II. And as time goes by, you can imagine it gets very, very hot. These are cramped submarines to begin with. Men start to really have trouble breathing. Nobody can sleep. It's 100% humidity on the submarine. I included this picture just to get a sense for how cramped it would be. Nobody could sleep on the puffer. You tried to lay down on these vinyl covered sleeping bunks that are there, and everybody was just sweating completely. Over time, they couldn't the head got all backed up because they couldn't flush it because that would alert they thought the ships on the surface to where they are. Men start to really suffer from hypoxia, suffer from a lack of air. It really becomes flammable inside the submarine, but there's not enough oxygen in the submarine to start a fire. So thankfully, there's a doctor who goes around. He gives everybody some shots of liquor to brace themselves. There's a guy that walks around with a mumps and lung container and he releases air where he can, just a little bit of air in all the various compartments. 38 hours though go by. Eventually, what happens to some of the sailors? Some of them temporarily lose their minds a bit. One guy tried to unscrew the hatch so he could get out. They're 500 feet underwater. One guy had to be physically restrained and put in chains because he went after somebody with a wrench. Another member of the crew started hallucinating, thought he was back on his farm, started running around the sub trying to capture his chickens. He thought he was seeing chickens. So 38 hours on the submarine, they suffer from heat stroke, they suffer from dehydration, they go into a stupor, men start to just fall asleep and collapse. There's no air. And again, they start hallucinating until finally the ships on the surface start to go away and start to leave. And after 38 hours, the submarine is able to surface. Nobody died. The puffer made it. But again, 38 hours in a submerged submarine was unheard of at the time, and it was a record that lasted through the war. And so there's a long chapter on just what that was like for these individuals. But talk about endurance and just talk about a story of young men as officers on these ships really dealing with a lot of adversity. And I want to end with a story about four members of the class, but particularly Ray Calhoun. And Ray Calhoun is one of my favorite characters that I write about in the book. And he's just a real inspiration. He grew up in Philadelphia, son of a naval officer who served in World War I, who died at the war's end while in France. He was a captain of a ship, was walking on the dock right next to his ship when a crane carrying a load of supplies, the supplies snapped free and landed on him, landed on Ray Calhoun's dad. So Ray Calhoun's dad dies when he's very young. And at the time, if you had a father who died in service, you were able to get into any one of the academies of your choosing. So Ray Calhoun chooses to be a Naval Academy midshipman. has a bit of a rough start in the Navy. He's turned back 1 year, so he graduates a year late with the class of 38. And he's kind of lost a little bit. He had a few disciplinary problems. He had a CO who said, "Look, if you don't shape up, I'm gonna bust you out of the Naval Academy." So it took him a little while to sort of find his bearings, but he ultimately did, and he becomes captain of a destroyer in 1944 that is serving with Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet about 500 miles off the coast of the Philippines. And he's part of the fleet in this little destroyer that sails into Typhoon Cobra. And Typhoon Cobra is a fairly well-known story. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. It's a huge storm that Halsey sails his fleet into. You got to remember, meteorology at that time is very rudimentary. This is actually a picture of Typhoon Cobra that was taken off of a radar screen. You get a sense for just how big and bad of a storm this was. And actually, if you look at some of the barometric readings that came out and that were registered during the storm's fury, it's still one of the lowest barometric readings of any typhoon ever recorded. I think there's one that was had a lower reading and thus a worse storm than Cobra. Terrible storm. And Halsey sails his fleet right into it for a variety of different reasons. Didn't mean to, but he and his meteorologist, he's given bad advice basically, but he's still trying to kind of get the fleet out of the storm. And ultimately, what he does is he just continues to sail the fleet along the track of the storm. So the fleet stays in the middle of this storm for much, much, much longer than it should. And it is a bad storm. And Ray Calhoun is captain of this ship right here. This is the Dewey. It's a Farragut class destroyer. Farragut class destroyers were an interesting group of destroyers because when they were first built, they were good. They were good destroyers. But what the Bureau of Ships did during the war to all of the Farraguts was bolt on a bunch of new armaments to its deck. They bolted on a bunch of new radar equipment to its deck and its mast. And when they did all that, they made the ship top heavy. They knew they were doing that, but they did it anyway. It's never really explained why they did that and what they thought would happen. But what happened was you have a top heavy destroyer in the middle of a horrible storm. You can imagine what happens. Dewey is one of those captains of these destroyers, and he is a captain, even though he's young. He's not a captain in rank, but he's a captain in command of a ship, and his ship is the Dewey. And I talked about those moments of connection that happened during the war for members of the class of 38, and this is just another one. And I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to go be fairly quick here, but it's not just the Dewey that hits as the Farragut class destroyer in the middle of Typhoon Cobra. He's one of four members of the class of 38 who are in that fleet that day who are captains of Farragut class destroyers. Now, this is an aircraft carrier that's part of that fleet. You can see the trouble it's having in the storm. It's getting almost blown over to one side. So you can imagine if a carrier is having that kind of a problem, what's going on with the Farragut destroyers. And these are just some of the pictures. They were having all sorts of problems. They were listing and they were leaning and they were rolling almost 73, 74 degrees. The list meter that they had, the needle was pointing off the 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 gauge. It was so bad. They would lean to one side and then get tossed around and lean to the other side. And they never really knew once they were leaning over if they would come back or not. It's just an amazing story of Ray Calhoun during Typhoon Cobra with these other members of his class. These are the four members of the class. You had Calhoun on the Dewey. The second guy is Bruce Monahan. I'm sorry, Bruce Garrett. And he's aboard the Monahan, another Farragut class destroyer. And so he's captain of that ship. I've seen a lot of folks really look at that picture and get very sad. He looks like he's so young, and he is so young, but he's a captain of a ship, apparently a very good one. The Monahan rolls over at one point and doesn't recover. And the Monahan goes down. And unfortunately, Bruce Garrett goes down with his ship. James Marks is the third one. He's captain of the hull. And it goes down as well. Same sort of situation. It rolls over. It doesn't recover. And Marks ends up in the water with a number of members of his crew during this awful typhoon. He actually survives and he makes it, but his story is a very sad one. He struggles when he's in the water, and he struggles with command responsibilities in these moments of terror. But he makes it, and he gets through the war. And then the gentleman on the right is Bill Rogers. He's also command of a Farragut class destroyer called the Aylwin, and they survive. Calhoun's ship does survive the Dewey. The way it survives is pretty interesting. As you can see, all of these destroyers have two stacks, one right behind the bridge. On Calhoun's ship, the stack gets ripped off during the wind and the waves, which actually makes the Dewey more stable. The fact that that mast gets ripped off, the rolling doesn't, gets better, and they actually survived. They're a damaged vessel, but actually survived. It's a really interesting story of Typhoon Cobra. Halsey was taken to task for it, and there was a hearing, and there was some blame to go around. Ultimately, Halsey's not going to get touched, though. The war is too important. The war effort's too important. Marks testifies, but he doesn't want to throw anybody under the bus. Calhoun is at the hearing. I think if there's anyone to blame for the losses, and there were 3 ships that were lost during that storm, over 700 sailors died. It's the Bureau of Ships that should be to blame, but the war is too important, and they really can't devote the time to a disciplinary hearing. But fascinating story of the class of 38 during this great storm. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I think we've got around 10 minutes for questions. So let me stop and open it up. And if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear about them. Again, the book is called Scattered Far and Wide. It was published by the Naval Institute Press. And if you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear from you. Would love to hear what you thought.
Uh, Great.
Greg, any questions?
Yeah, we've already got a few in the queue. As a reminder, you can either use the raised hand feature or type your question in the chat at the bottom. And judging from the queue, it looks like everyone understood the directions. I'll go to Mike and then Brandon, and then I'll read 2 or 3 questions from the queue. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Mike.
Oh, great. Hi, how are you? Great talk. Very interesting. And just 2 actually kind of minor questions. When that submarine was down at 500 feet, below its, I don't know if it was near its crush level.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, past its test depth.
Yeah, but and you said I imagine things were breaking loose because of that, and there was flooding and everything. But wouldn't the pressure also be one of the factors in the effect on the men? Because they're
absolutely.
And
yeah, it's a great question, and absolutely it was. I mean, they were having intense headaches. So add the pressure to the list of things that they have to deal with. Pressure gauges were busting. I'm sorry, the glass in the gauges were busting. Lines were being ripped loose. The pressure was a horrible problem. And there were some concerns whether they were going to be able to ballast the ship enough to get it back up to the surface. And there was flooding. Flooding was angling down, or angling one end up. I think it was the bow end. So there was issues with that, and so there was just problem after problem. But absolutely the pressure was a problem that day for sure, causing all so much suffering in addition to everything else.
And what the crew was, I imagined a lot of them were hospitalized afterwards. I mean, what happened to the submarine after?
Yeah. So obviously they surface and they go straight back to Australia and call it a patrol. They all survived. Carl Dwyer actually survives the war, and so he's eventually high up in the submarine service. He's a very interesting guy. But yeah, the submarine makes it back. It was a really tough patrol for them because it's not only did this happen, it's one of those interesting stories where the submarine is sailing in what is supposed to be water that's over 1,300 fathoms deep, and they get hung up on a coral reef that wasn't on the charts. And it happened right before this. And they thought they were going to have to abandon the submarine at one point because they could not get the submarine off this coral reef that they had just run aground on. And it was in the middle of the water, middle of the ocean. They do get it off. It was one of those, Mike. It was one of those really bad luck patrols. But thankfully, yeah, they made it, and the puffer would see some future war patrols later on in the war and do much better. Yeah.
Okay. That is interesting. And excuse me, the second question is, you said that Marx, I think it was,
Yeah.
had some command problems when he went into the water. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, he it's it's one of those situations where he wasn't up for command, I think, when moments of crisis hit. There's some books about Typhoon Cobra that really sort of have a lot of criticism to levy on James Alexander Marx. And he's due for some of it, I think, sure. But you got to remember he was a young guy, and this was just a moment of sheer terror. He goes down with the ship. The criticism he gets once he's in the water is he sort of takes the mentality that it's every man for himself. He survives in the water for a number of hours. So do a number of his crew, but he doesn't try to rally them together. He sort of comes in contact with members of his crew in the midst of these massive waves, and he doesn't do anything of any substance. He just sort of lets them. He doesn't take control as a captain should, even in a moment like that. He had also come under criticism before the ship went down as showing a bit of panic. Interestingly, there were some who were questioning his command abilities even before they set sail. Some members of the crew, some older members of the crew, went AWOL and said, "We'll go into the brig. We're not going out in a ship that's commanded by James Marks." So there was a lot of questions about his command responsibilities and his leadership abilities even before all this happened. So yeah, he comes under no small amount of criticism throughout this story, unfortunately. But stays in the Navy, and even after the war is still in the Navy for a long time. And his career is a good one. Has some medical problems later in life, unfortunately, that also are a bit of a sad story. But yeah, he struggles a bit during Cobra, which is not surprising, but certainly when you put his reactions and his abilities up against some of the other members of the class, they came out, in a much better light. Yeah. Sorry,
Right.
Mike, I kind of droned on a bit.
No, 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 no. You answered the questions very well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hey,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks, Mike. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Sure. First, a sort of parenthetical comment and then a question. My comment is just, and I don't know if you're aware of this, I was reading for something else recently, and as I was reading through, they were talking about how Halsey had a meteorological unit that either was part of his staff or reported directly into the staff level, and that he never got information from them. He never regarded
Yeah.
what they had to say. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, it's exactly
But
right. The meteorologist he had with him on the New Jersey, I think, was his flagship. Was Commander George Costco, who by all accounts was a good meteorologist, but Costco during the Cobra really made some mistakes. And again, it's not entirely his fault. They were reliant on weather stations kind of scattered around the Pacific. They didn't have satellites, obviously. So Costco was getting pieces of information, not a complete picture. And the information was always hours old. It was coming from a variety of different places. He had to kind of piece it all together. He thought he was in a tropical depression for a long, long, long time. So they were still trying to fuel their ships during the middle of what he thought was really just a storm. He didn't know it was this typhoon. He didn't give Halsey good advice, but honestly, and that's unfortunate. He needed to. There were also messages that would have been crucial that weren't, decoded in enough time. They sat on desks and weren't delivered in enough time. It was just a comedy of errors when it comes to the meteorology that happened at that time. But yeah, Costco needed to do better. Certainly Halsey needed to do better, but you have to kind of approach it with an understanding of the limitations that they had at that time. Yeah, great question.
well, my main question was, you mentioned in passing Craig Simmons' book on the 1940 class, and I was just wondering, have you or has anybody ever done comparison to like the equivalent classes at Ejima or whatever the British naval school is, I forget what it is, or
Yeah.
even the Italians.
Wouldn't that be a great story? I have really kind of gone down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out what happened to guys who graduated from their schools right before the war. You could do a GMA, you could do the Royal version, the German version, maybe not as interesting, but the Italian version, or oh gosh, the Dutch version would be interesting. I have sort of an idea of maybe thinking about what happened to the guys who were part of this class who went off into the Marine Corps. Wasn't a lot. It was about 20 or so. I know some of them had some really interesting experiences though, so that would be interesting. Yeah, Brandon, I think it's a pretty rich vein of information, rich mine, and you know it's been done before. There have been a lot written on the West Point, various classes there, by a lot of really extraordinary writers, and Craig Simmons' book is just great. But yeah, I think we're onto something. It's a great idea, and just a number of really interesting things that can come out of this. But I don't know of any that have approached it from some of the other countries, other nations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Brandon. I'll take one from the queue. Steve asked, just curious, how does one decide to become a blimp pilot as opposed to a fixed wing aircraft?
You know, I wondered that very same thing, and I couldn't really figure that out. There's not really an explanation for why at least Ernie Cody went into the blimp service. I don't know if it was a choice. I think what probably happened is the Navy did what the Navy does and says, we need you over here, so that's where you're going, regardless of what your personal feelings are. I know that's how they assigned people, naval aviators, to specific squadrons and types of planes, whether it was a Catalina, whether it was a torpedo bomber, or whether it was a fighter. They had no real choice. The Navy just assigned you where the Navy assigned you. So my hunch is that's what they did with Ernie Cody. You're flying blimps, and you're going to like it, kind of thing. But I couldn't find any evidence that he wanted to fly blimps and so chose that. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, that concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture in Q&A. Again, the book
Thank you.
Scattered Far and Wide, the Naval Academy Class of 38 at War by Justin LaBorde. Please join us next Saturday, March 14th at 1 p.m. when historian Vince O'Hara, no stranger to this group, will discuss his latest book, The Greatest Naval War Ever Fought, which examines not only all the major naval contests in the European and Pacific theaters, but also offers detailed analysis of secondary navies such as France, Italy, and the Soviet Union. Hopefully you can join us. Vince is a great historian, I'm sure, as you all know. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at our next talk. And Justin, special thanks to you. That was a great presentation and Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Take care.